Welcome everyone to another Insider Community Practice session. Today I want to welcome Sam Hinds, a scholar, writer, poet, imaginal practitioner, and the explorer of emerging cultural edges of collective communion. Sam is also a psychotherapist and adjunct professor at California Institute of Integral Studies, where he earned his MA in philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness. He holds a Ph.D. in clinical psychology with an emphasis in depth psychology with Pacifica Graduate Institute, and brings a depth of training rooted in both the clinical and the imaginal. Across more than a decade of formation, he has trained in psychedelic-assisted therapy, psychodynamic approaches, internal family systems, and archetypal psychotherapy. Alongside his formal education, Sam is a dedicated practitioner of meditation and imaginal contemplative traditions, including Vajrayana Buddhism, Mahamudra and Dzogchen, and Rob Burbea's teachings on Emptiness and Soulmaking Dharma. He's also a devoted practitioner of Ria Beck's collective presencing and brings extensive personal experience with relational imaginal practices. Today we'll start with a short dialogue and orientation, and then we'll dive into the communal reverie practice and finish up with a group harvest and reflection. Sam, welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Artem. It's good to be here.
Awesome. Yeah, good to have you, and it's been good to connect. And I'd love to start with, maybe you speaking a little bit about what communal reverie practice is and kind of how you've come to discover it, develop it, facilitate it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, communal reverie kind of was born at the start of 2021. I think so. After COVID hit, I, along with a lot of other folks in the liminal web / meta modern scene, kind of started tuning into the Stoa as a way of not only learning a lot and kind of expanding a lot during a time of like intense contraction on a collective level, but also discovering a lot of the practice fields that were cropping up there. And that's where I first discovered collective presencing with Ria Bach. And so I started to kind of practice in that field regularly and started reading Ria's book on the topic. And for folks who haven't encountered collective presencing before, one of the core kind of motifs of that practice is speaking about something called the group field. And Ria Bach introduces this notion of subtle sensing. So it's this notion that there's some kind of emergent, subtle, shared qualitative experience that emerges in any group when a certain kind of full-bodied listening and kind of shared depth of presence is brought. And then there's actually something that it feels like to tune into that and begin to speak to and from that. So they call it speaking to and from the middle in collective presencing. And on one level, there's a sense of just practicing, sensing, and coming from that place. Ria Bach would call that the circle of presence. And then there's a deeper sense in which that practice is oriented to kind of collective emergence, that actually something wants to come through. There's a latent potential that maybe calls everybody forward. And she calls that the circle of creation. Before discovering collective presencing, I actually just had this experience, I'll call it, that led to this like intuition or intimation of a group practice that would kind of unfold by folks kind of getting together and listening deeply, and something becoming available by virtue of everyone's shared presence. And when I discovered collective presencing, I was like, oh, this is right on the track of what I was sensing into. And actually Ria was drawing on Sri Aurobindo and Gebser, so those sort of integral lineages, and I would say integral mystical lineages. So it felt in deep resonance. This was particularly Gebser. It was something I was taking in quite a bit when the intuition or the idea for group practice came in. And so I just called together a small group with folks I met in the collective presencing milieu. One of them, Cheryl Shu, the other one, his name's Cristiano Siri. And I just reached out to them and let them know that I had a sense that it may be interesting to experiment with something similar to collective presencing, but to actually have an imaginal kind of focus, to actually let image be the thing that we're tuning into together. They said that sounded interesting, so we started jumping on calls together, and like for a year on a weekly basis, we would meet up and would recurrently just dive into this practice. At the time I was writing my dissertation, I thought I was going to write on a clinical topic. It was going to be like ketamine-assisted therapy, Jungian something. And something kind of pulled me in this less conventional direction, and started bringing collective presencing and Gebser really into dialogue with various traditions on the imaginal, and even felt that there was this there's some resonances between what Ria was talking about in terms of the group field and latent potential, and kind of being called forward to a possibility that is almost luring from the future, and the way that the French scholar of comparative religion, Henri Corbin, he's the one who kind of coined the term imaginal, as it's kind of been getting popularized in the culture. The way he spoke about certain forms of like Islamic mysticism, there's a whole framework and kind of Neoplatonic metaphysics around this, but he has this notion of what he calls the angel out ahead. And it's this idea that, when engaging in imaginal mystical practice, actually the deepest possibility and expression of that is, from one angle, it's connecting with one's, you could say, celestial identity. That's one way he could frame it. One's origin and archetype. He would call it the celestial I sometimes, which is, I guess, this notion, there's some kinship here with Jung's notion of individuation, but it's couched in a more mystical frame, but that any individual's personality already has its wholeness and fullest expression, perhaps in the subtle realm. And as a mortal mystic, what you're actually doing is kind of connecting with that and fostering the conditions whereby that timeless blueprint of your personality becomes something that lures out from the future. So you'd speak of the angel out ahead, this notion of the angel. It's something that's calling you from the future, and yet it's something outside of time. The one thing is that, at least for Corbin, like, these mystical practices are inherently individual. It's something that only an individual can partake in. Your celestial I is yours and yours alone. Nobody else can connect to that. And there's actually something that mystical journey needs to be absolutely personal. Whereas what Ria is talking about, that there's something inherently collective about that. The circle of creation is actually inherently a shared phenomenon. You need a collection of individuals, and the latent possibility that's calling is not possible without all of the individuated capacities and diversity of the people present in the group. So I started to get kind of curious about the dialogue between those two ways of looking, and wondering if there's some kind of imaginal background to what Ria calls the circle of creation. And if that's sort of leaping beyond this kind of individual focused mystical orientation that Corbin's pointing to, that's, maybe rooted in these axial age kind of traditions. There's a number of folks who talk about something like a second axial age. And other we-space practitioners, in particular, I'm thinking of the work of Thomas Scheininger and Elizabeth DeBold, who developed something called emergent dialogue. They introduced this notion of trans-individuation, which is pointing to something very similar, that if what we call the axial age happened, different ranges of dates on it, we could loosely say between 500 and 800 BCE, the emergence of the major world religions, kind of Buddhism and Judaism, kind of monotheistic religion, Taoism, you could say, and the Upanishads all kind of flowered out of that period. But a lot of scholars have pointed out that there seemed to be some intensified impulse toward individuation that came about in that time period. And what they're positing with some of these collective practices in this we space is there may be something that's reaching beyond individuation that's kind of emerging, and it's something akin to a second axial age. So whatever this time between worlds we're in that meta-modern folks like to speak about, I know some folks are talking about a second renaissance, and there's probably something important about that, but talking about a second axial age even throws us in a much larger time frame. And so it seems like there's maybe something that's some process underway that's maybe retaining the intensified emphasis on individuality that took a couple thousand years to really emerge and crystallize, maybe between the birth of the axial age and that kind of flowering of modernity. And now something that's actually folding individuality into a more complex process that's weaving back in with the collective. And there's some intensified balance between individuality and collectivity, say. So that, that's like the kind of big, very zoomed out picture. For the most part, at this point, communal reverie, when it comes to doing the practice collectively, I've been more playing in something that would be more like the equivalent of what Riabok calls the circle of presence. So it's just practicing the collective modality. I think that there's probably a lot of conditions that need to be in place before that circle of creation really starts to emerge. Really, I just want to hold spaces where we can begin to kind of practice this form of like collective imaginal attunement, which means imaginal practice becomes not something like is a solitary mystic. I think there's a very, very important dimension to doing one's own imaginal practice. And I think one will be unfolding latent possibilities within themselves that do have an inherently personal quality. But I'm also curious about what starts to happen when we maybe enter a little bit more porosity, a little bit more tuning into something shared, a bit more kind of collectively unfolding things in the imaginal register, and having something of a shared experience as far as that's possible. And what's it like to just begin to cultivate that and open up that possibility that there's some kind of imaginal interbeing or more porosity between individuals. We can actually get a taste of that and see what starts to emerge. There's all kinds of other details, but I'll leave it there for now.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there, and I appreciate you unpacking all of that. And yeah, Adam, feel free also to dive in here, or if you have like a question or idea or anything impacts you, I'd love to kind of expand this dialogue here that we're having. But yeah, I'll just reflect a couple of things that I heard that I think is interesting. It's you mentioned doing Riabok's collective presencing, and this notion of how that practice is about speaking to the middle. So it's really focusing on like what's arising between practitioners doing this practice. And then you got fascinated with the notion of the imaginal and working with images. And it's like, what would this practice be like if we only focused on images? So I guess one question is, I'm curious about like, what is it about images? What is it about the imaginal? I think you also, in your primer, you speak about the difference between imaginary and imaginal. I have curiosity around that. And then, you also mentioned Corbin's notion of the angel out ahead, which to me sounds almost kind of like the daemon. Like it's like, what is calling you? What is driving you? And the way that he conceptualized or spoke about it is very individual, as you said, where Ria speaks more about the collective and this notion of the circle of creation. So it's more about what arises here between us. And I agree with you that there's probably a lot to be discovered in the individual process, but also in the group process. And personally, I've been really interested in we space practices and like what emerges between us, who I become in relationship, who I become in the collective. I feel like it affords so much richness. And I think a lot of us in like post-conventional terrain are kind of, you get kind of bored with, your individual self, or, you see the limits of individuality. Like there's a limitation inherent in that. And I think a lot of that's also tied up with modernity, and that being a very like hyper individualized kind of perspective or way of functioning in the world. So I very much resonate with this opening up into the collective. But yeah, just wondering if like what comes up in my reflections, anything around like what's so significant about image or how the imaginal is different than the imaginary.
Yeah, beautiful. So yeah, Corbin's famous paper is based on a lecture he delivered in the late 60s. It's called Mundus Imaginalis, Latin for like the imaginal world, imaginal realms, sometimes it's translated as. And the subtitle was I always mix the two around, but it was something like on the imaginary and the imaginal. And there's a correspondence between what Corbin is distinguishing as the imaginary versus the imaginal, and what the philosopher Kant distinguished as what he called the productive and reproductive imagination. The philosopher Samuel Taylor Coleridge likely spoke about imagination, and really he had discussions of primary and secondary imagination, and what he called fancy. So the imaginary or fancy or the reproductive imagination does seem to be, it's a faculty within us that is capable of kind of, from the level of the conscious ego, the part of us that has a sense of deliberately thinking thoughts, and having a kind of agency over what's going on in our subtle inner world. We have a capacity to perhaps abstract from our concrete sensory experience and remix it, right? And just generate things. So, for example, I could say, imagine a pink elephant eating a mango right now. For folks who at least don't have aphantasia, which is an interesting condition that sort of means that there's not access to subtle inner images. Most people can have some version of that image come up, And that's something that from the level of the conscious ego, I just kind of decided in a more or less arbitrary way. So that would be the imaginary for Corbin. And one of the things that Corbin is suggesting is that, at least for the modern Western mind, for a long time, just based on its own unfolding and which philosophical orientations kind of came into dominance in shaping our modern worldview, that is the equivalent of the imagination in its totality, right? So what imagination is something, it's a faculty whereby we can fabricate things that deviate from what is real, the kind of empirical data of our sensory experience that we might be able to understand better through reasoning and a kind of applied reasoning through the scientific method. And then, we can go off, in imagination, and maybe it's nice, and maybe we can, write entertaining literature through that. And maybe in some cases we can put it to good use, with our rational faculty and strategize or deliberately imagine other possibilities. But we're getting it's ontologically diminished in a certain way. It's less real, and it really has no it has no ontological value beyond the individual who's doing the imagining. So it is a private thing that an individual is doing at that moment. And it's getting away from what is more real. Now, the imaginal for Corbin, there's all sorts of different ways that he spoke about it, but this is where he's sort of introducing a more Neoplatonic kind of view of things. Aside from calling it the mundus imaginalis, and what he was usually doing was kind of translating various Arabic terms, usually from these Sufi mystics that he was reading. The two major figures would be Ibn Arabi and Suhrawardi, these two great Sufi mystics. He's introducing that there's this other modality where the imagination has something that he would call it the active imagination. That could get kind of conflated with Jung's notion of what he called active imagination, but it's a little different because he's translating a kind of Persian Neoplatonic idea here into the active imagination. And what it is, he says, is something more like a mirror, or it's like a subtle faculty, an organ that's actually capable of apprehending the mundus archetypus, It's another term he used. So the archetypal world. So he says the active imagination is like the mirror for the images of the archetypal world. And so this is very different because there's some sense in which what's arising is not just being willy-nilly fabricated by the waking ego. Actually, the activity of the waking ego is kind of suspending itself, and there's a kind of mirror being held out. And then what is arising, you would call them images in suspense, but it's like these deep kind of archetypal forms body forth a certain way. Right? And where they body forth is in the imagination. So it has that same kind of subtle phenomenology that we have when we're deliberately imagining, or we're engaging in imaginary processes. The main difference is that there's an agency that's expressing itself and arising in the imaginal stratum, so through the imagination. So, I mean, that's a little bit there. And there's, of course, all these presuppositions around a sort of frame that is Neoplatonic that Corbin's holding. But basically, there's something like a subtle realm. There's something like processes. You could say beings, forms that have a more spiritual nature that are then showing themselves forth and taking on some kind of form. And the imaginal is the place where that is possible.
Yeah, beautiful. Welcome, Lena. And I'm curious also, Adam, if anything, as you're hearing Sam talk, if there's anything that arises for you, you could unmute yourself if you want to share. It's not necessary, but yeah.
I've got quite a lot coming up. I mean, this is like so interesting to me. I'm a massive Rob Burbea fan. I've probably listened to like all of his talks at this point. And I think where to even start a little bit, but I think maybe connecting with like the metamodern piece of like, how we're relating to like individualism and then the collective. And to me, I feel like the imaginal is like maybe not, the last piece, but a piece that's not leaving something out of the human experience. Like I've typically felt like there's like so much richness in my life. And I discovered this sort of through Rob Burbea. I think mostly he like to me, it's like, oh yeah, there's so much stuff here that I actually feel and care about. And it's not accessible in my life. And it does feel like this is kind of the avenue for me, like the imaginal, the archetypal, like I've been getting into Kabbalistic stuff. And so there's all sorts of really interesting, like fascinating stuff that I'm just like, my being is just like launching towards it somehow. And I'm not sure if I have any questions. Mostly I'm just very excited to be doing to be joining in a practice like this where it's, I'm just really very impressed by how much like knowledge of the individuals and the history you have on this topic, because I really don't. And so it's a pleasure to be present for all this.
Yeah. So, thanks, Adam. I'm also a big fan of Rob Burbea and Cheryl Shu, who I mentioned, who was a person who's really involved in the development of communal reverie practice. I'd been aware of Rob Burbea. I think I'd listened to a conversation he'd had about emptiness with Daniel Thorsten on the Emerge podcast, but she had sent me the Dharma Seed recordings of, I think it was a 2015 retreat called The Path of the Imaginal. And I remember listening to the first talk on that and hearing Rob name drop folks like Richard Tarnas, who was a teacher of mine at CIIS. He name dropped Coleridge. He name dropped Owen Barfield. Owen Barfield was one of the Oxford Inklings, so he was friends with J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, but he was actually a very deep philosopher. And I was actually kind of influenced by Rudolf Steiner. And his philosophy and his notion of what he called original and final participation has a lot to do with the archetypal realm. And you could say the imaginal, though he talks about it in a different way. But what started becoming apparent to me when Rob was starting to introduce all these things, he had this familiarity with these discourses that on a philosophical level, I had a deep relationship with, but he was weaving it into a path of actual practice and actually showing a way to start living the stuff that these philosophers talk about. And I remember I was like walking, it was still COVID. I was like walking around on, listening to on my headphones to a podcast in neighborhoods and just like, just feeling so excited. And yeah, I feel like it deeply paid off, sticking with Rob. And of course, we can talk about the uniqueness that Rob brings in with kind of weaving it in with the conception of emptiness and how that can fit in with metamodernism and how we can kind of be in these like beautiful, kind of rich, imaginal worlds that open up and also hold it all lightly and hold it transparently. And maybe even the ways that actually has some resonance with the way that the Sufi mystics related to what was going on imaginally. To an extent, there is some sense in which we want to suspend our kind of literalism about what's coming through and not reify it. But there are also differences, and I'm probably not the most sophisticated mind to really look at the difference between what emptiness is saying and what some of these Sufi mystics were saying in terms of the kind of metaphorical nature of the way that the divine comes to take a kind of precise presence in one's own kind of theophanies, right, or divine revelations that are specific to the individual who's accessing them. But yeah, well, that could be said there.
Yeah, I'm happy to have Adam, you bring in Rob Burbea into this conversation, as I'm also a big follower of. I've been following his work for a while, like reading his books, listening to his Dharma talks, and actually found Tom Cheetham through Rob Burbea, because actually Rob Burbea had like a huge list of books, and Rob Burbea would talk a lot about James Hillman, and then I was looking at some of his books, and he was mentioning Tom Cheetham's book, and Tom Cheetham is this guy who's like an expert on Corbin and James Hillman and Jung and the Imaginal, and I actually had him on a podcast a while back. So yeah, like all these threads are super interesting, and yeah, I just wanted to kind of reflect like what I was hearing you say, Sam, about the difference between the imaginary and imaginal, just to see if I'm getting it right. It seems like you were saying that the imaginary is more of like, it's like abstraction. It can kind of take us away from presence or from reality. And it's also like very like individual. So I think about like dreams, right? Like if you have a certain dream and I try to make sense of it, like it wouldn't make any sense, because you might understand the symbols and the things that arise in any given person's mind is in a way unique to themselves. But then also there's, if we look at the imaginal, that it tunes in, it's like a deeper, maybe more into the unconscious layers, more into the, archetypical, right? Like these archetypal motifs. And it seems like so the distinction between these seem very, to me, like very subtle. Like it could be very easy to be operating from the imaginary rather than imaginal. So that's kind of like the one thing that comes up for me. It's like, actually being able to sense and tune into that. Like it seems to be very subtle.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting even with the point of dreams, and I can weave this into some of the interesting ambiguities of what comes up, say, in communal reverie practice, but even with dreams, right? Like, and this is where I guess I might move more into depth psychological territory and think with Jung or something, where we have this kind of spectrum of material that might arise in dreams, and you might have stuff that's more personal to the particularity of somebody's complexes coming in, and there's maybe something very, very individual that's being expressed in the dream that came through for that person because their own unconscious material is being worked out. But then you can have what Jung called big dreams, capital B, big dreams, where that's almost like, and he would frame it as the collective unconscious, but where like deeper, more kind of collective archetypal material is coming through. If you even, look at the origins of active imagination, like Jung started having these visions, like in the moments leading up to World War II, he thought that what was going on, and he had this notion, he had like two different instances where he had these visions of the Swiss Alps, and he was Swiss, kind of surrounded by this like churning flood, and the ocean was filled with blood and all this stuff. And you can read that, almost like the Alps as a symbol for his own waking consciousness, and the rising ocean as a symbol for like the kind of violent process of his own unconscious, or the unconscious kind of coming up, and it might be threatening like a psychosis that his ego is about to go underwater, so to speak. And that's actually what he thought was happening initially. And then when World War One broke out, or no, it was World War One at the time. He suddenly said, he actually thought that he was accessing something of collective relevance, right? So that even goes to show that like there's some probably inherent ambiguity of like what level does this material reflect, and sometimes it could be some strange like interspersion and intermingling of different layers at the same time, is my guess. But just to weave that into communal reverie practice, while this generally doesn't come up so strongly, we could hold some of that inquiry, as being present anytime we're doing communal reverie practice, which is to say we're all setting the intention to kind of tune into the field together and share what's coming through. And I can say a little bit, I can do some light scaffolding of the practice before we jump into it. But we could hold that inquiry of being like, what layer of imaginal territory, is this stuff reflecting? Are we accessing the mundus archetypus, if we want to frame it that way, or just accessing something where these archetypal images have a shared relevance here? And does stuff ever come in that might be snatching something from a more personal layer and weaving it in? And how would we distinguish those things? And it's an endlessly fascinating inquiry.
Yeah, I'm super fascinated with just the idea of discernment. Like, how do we discern aspects of reality? I think that's just like a huge question for me. That's like an ongoing thing of like what that is for me inside me, and just different aspects of reality. How do we discern? So yeah, perhaps we can start moving towards the orientation. I would like to give you some space, Lena, if there's anything that was arising for you. I know you just kind of joined a little bit late, so maybe you didn't catch all of the conversation, but if there's anything that's coming up for you.
Hi Sam, hi Adam, hi Artem. First, this is the second meeting of yours, Artem, that I've been scattered to, and major apologies today with a tech difficulty. I just moved, but it's good to be here, and I love your work, so I am here present today. And oh man, the imaginal, the imagination. This is such a beautiful place to be spontaneously. I just wanted to say that I've always looked at the imaginal as an organ of perception, as kind of this beautiful, almost second lung. I'm currently studying the neuroscience of creativity. So I really do believe that the imaginal, through my study of Jung's psychology and collective consciousness, I do believe that we hold the power to reach the imaginal, and that it's a physical being of sorts that exists to kind of awaken us into our higher selves and future possibilities. So I love all the names that were mentioned, and I've really delved in, but this practice is new to me, and oh my gosh, I'm excited to be here. There's so much depth and beauty in this world. But it starts inside each and every one of us, right? So yeah, here I am. And lots of love to you, Artem. And yeah, let's move on. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Lena. I love, there's like a light shining in back of you. It's like the radiance is emanating from you. So yeah.
No, this work is so true to my being. It's where I feel most alive, is in the imaginal. So Plugs.
Cool. I'm happy we're gonna get to experience this. And yeah, with that, Sam, maybe you can start orienting us towards the practice.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to do that. Yeah, so I guess this is the part where we just kind of talked about the imaginal and introduced all these cool, fun frames, and like this part we just drop all of that, just really like let that stuff go and just wade into a direct encounter with the territory as we find it. So, usually when I'm opening this sort of space, usually we just spent a lot of time talking about the imaginal, but I'll give a very simple way of framing the imaginal for the purposes of this practice, just to say the imaginal is that place where the imagination, or the deep imagination, expresses its own agency. It expresses its own autonomy, right? So we actually become receptive in a certain way. I like to call it assuming a posture of imaginal hospitality. So we become open, kind of inviting, and seeing what comes. And I'll borrow this from Rob Burbea and Catherine Mickey, sprinkle a little bit of trust on what comes, because it's very typical for the kind of critical, rational mind, to doubt and be suspicious, and it's good that we have that faculty, and this is a practice space, so we can just practice seeing what happens when we suspend that a little bit. If there's a little bit of discernment, just letting that be there, like not needing to get the mind out of the, completely out of the way, but also not taking this like too seriously and getting grumpy about it, like we're just practicing something kind of new here, but really just becoming receptive and relating to the imaginal as that place where the imagination expresses its own agency, its own autonomy. And so the way this practice works, I'll kind of guide us in briefly, and then I'll ring a bell. And at that point, the floor is open. So when the floor is open, really the invitation is that we will together be kind of listening from a very full-bodied kind of presence. And almost as though we're listening to the shared space here from that place of imaginal receptivity, hospitality. Whoever in the group really feels like something is coming up first, has an image coming, is invited to be the first to just describe what's coming. We have some Rob Burbea folks here, so I'll just say a little bit about image, just to open up what image can mean. Because yes, image can be that you have something arising in you could call it quasi-visual register. It's as though you're seeing something in your mind's eye. It has that you're seeing, not with your physical eyes, right? As though you're seeing something. It doesn't have to be that modality. In fact, it can be any subtle sensory modality. It can be like imaginal sense, imaginal tactile qualities, or auditory. Right? But it also can just be like a subtle intuition of information or context. Like there's some kind of imaginal place opening up, or situation, or something is happening in the imagination, and you just know things about it. Or you might get like a phrase that's coming that just has this resonance, right? But the real thing is it arising? Is it almost surprising you? Is it coming up of its own accord? So I just want to open up the different modalities that image can take on in this context. And so the first person who really has something coming is invited to share it into the middle, so to speak. And there's often a moment, and I would also invite everyone to stay really close to their experience, because often in real time, as you're describing it, it's still unfolding. And so sometimes you're following it, you're staying in intimate contact with what you're describing as it's unfolding. But there's often a moment where it feels complete, the moment. And the invitation is just like to indicate that, to say that's it for now, or that's all for now. In collective presencing, we use a talking piece. We say, I pick up the piece, I put down the piece. this is the equivalent of that, or like with a walkie-talkie going over, and it just signals to the group that the floor is open again. Because the invitation here is that when somebody else is sharing, to really receive what's being shared and discover the possibility that what is being described then arises and starts to body forth and actually animates itself in your own imaginal experience. Right? And from there, it may actually unfold in new directions that weren't described. It can actually take on a life of its own. And so to be open to that possibility that there's a kind of imaginal porosity between all the bodies here, we can notice the way that something unfolds in between. So when the floor is open, and somebody says, that's it for now, that's all. Well, whatever it is that indicates you're done. It may be that it does often happen that there's some kind of continuity, or kind of shared unfolding. But I also want to emphasize it doesn't have to be that way. So if something's coming through for you that doesn't immediately seem directly connected, but it is what is arising, that's fine. Feel free to share that. I think the thing to really stay with is just trusting what's arising in your experience. And then the next person who shares also does the same thing, shares to the time that it feels complete, indicate when you're done, and essentially we'll just almost popcorn style, whenever somebody feels ready to speak, can just name what's coming, indicate when they're done, and the floor's open again. And for a certain amount of time, we'll just be engaged in this kind of shared imaginal unfolding. Also want to share that, with the protocol, sometimes we move slow. So spaciousness is very welcome here. Silence, very welcome here. Sometimes folks will forget to say, that's it for now, and let's just be playful and forgiving. And either if the person forgets, or if you're not sure and you might be jumping in early after a long gap, we can just be forgiving with each other and lighthearted and let this be a practice together. And we'll do this for some amount of time. And then maybe I'll check in with Artem about how much time would be good to have to debrief, and I'll ring the bell again. And that will bring us back across the threshold, and we can just kind of chat, riff, debrief in a less kind of formal practice mode. So I think that's probably good enough for the basic framing, but I also want to make space if there's any questions or anything that would be helpful to clarify.
Yeah, I think we can go for 20 or 30 minutes. I think 30 should be fine. I don't think I have any questions. If anybody else has any questions. Yeah, I think we're maybe good to go, Sam.
Okay, beautiful. Yeah, so I often like to say that this practice, it's like a box of chocolates in the Forrest Gump sense. We never know what we're gonna get. So we'll find out. Okay.
I love that.
All right. So what I'm going to do here is, I might have some more background noise coming through as I do this, but for the sake of the bell, I'm going to turn my noise suppression off for a moment. And, so moving in, just really want to invite everyone to take a couple deep breaths. Just really let attention sink into the body fully, really inhabiting the full sensory field of the body. You can feel free to close your eyes if that's helpful. And then, as though you were listening closely from the tip of every nerve to the softest music that you can barely hear. And as though every nerve tip were listening to this very faint music from the tip of every nerve in a kind of shared space here between us. So just staying with this full body sensuous listening. and then just becoming hospitable, receptive to the emergence of image, however that might arise, however that might show up. And yeah, whoever feels like something's coming first is welcome to share it and indicate when they feel complete.
When we started, I automatically saw a hand with the palm facing towards me, and there was a gentle gesture of coming forth. And I felt this deep resonance, this deep harmonious peace. I was being invited in to my heart space. And the hand embraced my heart organ, my actual heart organ, and held it. And there was a sense of deep nurture and peace and awakening. But yeah, the symbol of the hand arose immediately, and the heart space. I feel complete.
I've been with a sense of vast, bright space. And as I was hearing Lena's voice, I was just getting a sense of water ripples rippling out. I'm complete.
As soon as the vast space was named, it was with like the hand making that like palm out gesture, but it was kind of rendered translucent, and there was a sense of like a bright, like almost like luminous star in vast space that was like shining directly through the translucent hand. And sort of with a number of other things connected with this hand, I had a very clear sense of like it's like the sleeve of a robe, like a delicate kind of cloth that's being blown by the wind. So where the robe sleeve hangs down, it's being stirred, blown, carried away by the wind. And I've also had a sense of running water. And what seems like the way it's been coming is almost like banyan tree roots, but banyan tree roots that are like both like running under the water and running through the arm, almost like into the fingertips. Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Ever since you said wind, I was just seeing these orange, half dried up leaves flying through the sky. And then they're kind of incinerating in flames. There's a fire, a sense of fire. Complete.
I'm sensing a deep connection. I'm seeing this pulsing energy traveling through the banyan tree, and the branches are growing and hitting the sun, and the sun is emanating in slow explosions. And those explosions, those little pieces of fire, are falling into the ocean, and kind of the ocean waves are carrying the fire and putting it out. And there's a human being on the beach, back to that hand image. And he's sitting, the hands are sitting and observing this cycle complete.
Urging resonances that were coming through as that was being shared. And somehow it was with these like orange kind of dry dead leaves were also being carried by the wind and like landing on the surface of the water. And the leaves themselves like were, shaped almost like hands, kind of shaped like hands, and would land on the water like boats. And the leaves started, as it like it gets dry, like they would start kind of curling in, almost like hands closing. And there was some resonance with the fire that was landing on the ocean, something similar here. And even some strange sense of like the four elements being present. There's almost like fire turning into earth, like landing on water, being carried by wind. And again, started feeling this resonance between the I guess, those vascular branches that are in leaves with like those banyan roots that were in the hand. And there's something that feels very elemental and some kind of like dance or process unfolding. And I'm really feeling into this quality, like the hands closing. But it's also like fire being both like extinguished and turned into earth. So that's it.
Yeah, I've been feeling a sense of earth this whole time since Lena mentioned the sun, the banyan tree kind of touching the sun, and just kind of feeling the light rays, seeing the light rays moving through the tree, through the roots into the earth. And it's like energizing, and just this sense of groundedness and dirt and earth, and like electricity moving through it, energy moving through it. Complete.
An image since quite early on of like it's like it is like a translucent hand, but it was like gripping my solar plexus, and then I think when Sam was just naming like the like orange leaves like looking like hands, and then like the Artem saying like they're burning, there's like a connection in that. In me there's like pain, like the um it's like the image of pain, um and then sort of imagining that like tension sort of dissolving or something, and like crumbled leaves or something like falling onto the earth. And in my image, it's like in my gut or something. Complete.
Yeah, as Adam was talking about the leaves, I just kind of saw them burning, that representation of pain and burning, and the leaves falling into the water and the fire going out, and there's just smoke arising. It's a lot of smoke. Complete.
I am picturing all of this happening on a beach, and I'm picturing the banyan tree continuing to grow tall through the sand, and the roots are burrowing under the sand, and they're alive in their own sense. And yeah, I am very present with that electric pulse. There's a really subtle energy, and it's cyclical. And the roots, there's the person, the hands reaching out their hands, and the roots are growing towards them. And the roots of the banyan tree slowly tickle the person's feet. And as the energy is transferred and the person's feet are being tickled, there is a sense of harmony and peace. And the leaves catch each little burst of fire and hold the fire. And now the fire isn't being extinguished, it's being held by the leaves of above water. Complete.
There's something that's also resonating now. It's something that came through early on, but I didn't name. Initially, feeling those banyan roots, it was like there was a place where they were under the running water. It was as if there was like a drop off or a cliff, and these tangles of banyan roots just moving down, and the water dispersing into droplets like a waterfall does, and almost like falling into space. And I've had this, it almost seems like as it all falls into space, and there's like a moment when it starts to resonate with the translucent hand. And it almost seems like where water becomes air, water turning into air, I almost want to say ether, like into air, into ether. And somehow the word translucent is coming. I can again see that like bright star that's behind the translucent hand. And I think like translucent, like lucent, I think it means light, loose. See, like translucent would be like what lets light through. Lets light through. And somehow there's like this, the translucence of water giving way to air, giving way to something even more subtle, and then light starts coming through. You can almost feel this whole spectrum of like the elements shading into or dying into each other. So they're more like a spectrum or a continuum here. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I've been just feeling energy in my body as you were speaking, Sam. And yeah, just with the sense of a bright light a formless energy just emanating as everything. And just really feeling that it being intangible, but also having a very real vibration through my body, and feeling it a lot in my hands and feet. This strong sense of energy building up. Complete.
I have this image of like, it's like a camera shot from high up, and it's looking like through a tree, and there's like fall leaves, and like beyond it is the image that I'm imagining from Sam's description. Like a lot of uh, uh, it feels like there's a lot of energy there, and the camera shot that I'm seeing, like this, the way I can describe it is like the fall leaves are just like very gently like swaying in the wind, like just very subtle, and they're in focus. And the other, like the way the light is like shining through like the water and light, and like something's happening is like out of focus, down, like further down. Complete.
Bodily energy. Really fun with that. And it brought me back to the hand gesturing to the heart space. Suddenly I'm feeling like that bright star or light that was shining from behind the hand, the translucent hand, now like shining in the heart center. And almost can feel it's like water, like the falling water running through the central column, the spine, also the banyan roots twining and somewhat gnarled. But yeah, now it's almost like the whole body is both like very elemental and like all these processes and textures and tensions, and then can just feel like that, the translucency and the light shining through from the heart at the same time. There's like the elemental body and I guess like the light shining through it all. That's it.
Mm. And as the elemental body transforms subtly, there's these subtle shifts and these little microbursts where the water and the electricity kind of meet and speak in their own subtle language, and the hand illuminates and the star seed travels. Now it has a pathway to travel, and it travels, and the hand rises and creates this synergy, and all of a sudden the hand extends further and further. And as the hand extends, it travels. And all of a sudden the hand hits the sun, but it doesn't get burnt. And there's a deep resonance and a deep whole. There's a deep synergy, a holistic integration, and the sun becomes aligned with the water, with the earth and the sand and the trees. The roots of the tree are the anchor that drive the synergistic alignment. Complete.
Alignment. I see a face of a lion in the sun. The sun is like a lion, and looking down, there's treetops with birds perched on top, speaking, and there's a language that they're speaking, and that the trees are speaking, and the earth is speaking, and there's somehow that they're all speaking the same language in their own dialects. And just feeling a sense of interconnection between these different levels, from the sunlight to the birds, to the trees, to the earth, to the space, the atmosphere that holds everything. Complete.
And as the sun illuminates, I'm imagining a fetus. There is a baby being born. Complete. There's a birth, a baby. Yeah. New life.
It's a very loud sense of a heartbeat. I can hear the heartbeat.
I have the sense that there's like a lot of care, and I'm not sure where it's coming from within this image. Complete.
There was an image of a burning red, like a ruby red heart. It's just burning with energy. Complete.
Mhm. Within the burning red, there is a small blue light. Complete.
Definitely this energy in the heart. It's a child, now like an infant, kind of like swaddled in cloth. The cloth is almost like wrapped around in a spiral. There's almost a sense of cloth kind of twisted and spiraling motion, and that's resonating with this back with the tree. But there's a like a torrent of wind that's almost spiraling like the cloth. It's a twisting, spiraling wind, and the way it is like lifting up the leaves, like lifting up dry leaves and carrying them up, and somehow, yeah, that deep energy of like care, lovingness, and a familiar image very much, but also I've at times had a sense of like the heart at the center and kind of four spokes moving out in a cross or mandala like pattern. Yeah, that's it.
Seeing the wind spiraling with the leaves moving through a blue light central channel that purifies and makes everything translucent and clear. And behind that, there is a red heart of loving care, compassion. Yeah, and there's like this interplay of layering of the heart, the red heart and the blue central channel, this tube of things coming and going and being empty and free and having a sense of meaning and mattering, sense of matter and light. Complete.
I have the words eternal mother coming up for me. Complete.
Lead us back out shortly, but I'll make some space if there's one more thing that wants to come through.
I just had a really deep vision of the baby's umbilical cord connecting to the branches of the tree, which were pulsating down to the roots, which were tickling the being's feet, and the hands radiating back to the sun, and there being this harmonious connection and the waves carrying the fire and the leaves, and just this beautiful, beautiful synergistic harmony in this whole imaginal world. Complete.
Okay. So we can just kind of open it up to either debrief and decompress from that or just chat. Here after that experience.
Felt very elemental. A lot of I was just noticing a lot of the images were I was started with space. There was just a bright white space of vastness, and then when Lena spoke, there was water, and then fire, and then earth, and then ether, and more space and white, luminous light. Yeah, it was interesting that that's the theme that I seem to kind of track or see that was emanating this kind of theme of elements, but also something about life and interconnectivity, things being connected. At the end, I was seeing too, like Lena was saying, the umbilical cord was connected to the tree, but when you said, Adam, the mother of, I don't know the phrase you used, the mother of all beings or something like that. And I was just like, oh yeah, it's I seen like a tree. It was like a woman that was like a tree that was connected to the earth. That was the earth and a part of the earth. And yeah, I don't know what to make of any of this, but those seem to be very rich themes for me.
I can go. Yeah, I noticed the main theme for me was my relation to the practice and to everybody's images. And at first I was like, oh, I'm having all these images and I'm disconnected from the group's imaginal field. And so as I started naming images, it was I was being brought in somehow. And my images started even the way my images worked, the out of focus thing. It was I was okay, I'm maybe somewhat connected, but then starting to, I'm still distant. And then towards the end, it was I was, the same way the baby was being swaddled and all this stuff. It was I felt like I was being brought in. And yeah, it's very interesting. The eternal mother words that camp at the end. It's just it connected to stuff in my own life. And yeah, it was a very interesting mix of being very poignant for me personally, and then the experience of connecting with each of your shares and how it all felt different, but it was still creating something together. It was quite a unique experience for me. And it constantly felt unsettled, not disturbed, but it hadn't settled. Within the practice, it's constantly there's more to discover. Complete.
The beauty of the imaginal is its infinite nature. It's always, in my opinion, in my world, it's always evolving. And that's what helps me to settle in the unknown, is knowing that it's all there, right here, right now, in the imaginal field, That infinite nature is both terrifying and absolutely liberating and freeing, right? It's all at the same time. It's where the divine paradox lies. So I love when you said that, the infinite nature. I'm sorry, my partner was leaving for a run, but yeah, that was incredible. I think I don't have words because I want to stay in the imagine. I have problems with coming back sometimes.
And I agree that it can be the whole process shifting gears, into the different register. And like this is like I'll just follow it because it's here, like a really loose hypothesis that I have. It's when you're talking about paradox, and actually Tom Cheetham points this out in one of his books, and I don't remember if it was in Imaginal Love. I think it might have been in All the World and Icon, actually, that he points out a paradox in the individuation process. They like in Corbin's work, where it's like the paradox that like the more individual you become, also the more universal and archetypal at the same time.
Yep.
And yeah, I've often spoken about archetypes as like non-finite specifying factors. So it's like there's something particular that's coming forward. It has a form, it has a shape. It's beginning to move toward definiteness, but there's also a sense of the kind of inexhaustibility and potential infinite well of meanings and associations and significances that an image can hold. I'm also in this session, at least, I was connecting with a lot of things that felt quite fundamental, or maybe like sometimes I like to call them the root archetypes, like the four elements, just being like a basic kind of separation into four categories, or you could say five is the ether, it's maybe the space in which all of that arises. And even the tree, and it's funny that the resonance between tree and mother came in. Like if you read passages on Jung, while the tree as an archetype is also it'll just ramify with associations, at least if you go in a Jungian direction, but it'll often link the tree with the great mother. I think he might have said eternal mother, Adam, which would also, something eternal or archetypal or something that never comes into being and perishes, and I have, maybe I have a sense that sometimes in this practice, when we're tapping into things together from a certain place, what we're tuning into might have that more general, like root archetype quality to it. The interesting thing is, at least in the individuation process, there's some strange thing where like those root archetypal patterns, these universal motifs, also start to riff on themselves in a way where they'll start being embodied in you, but also, and this is the interesting thing about individuation, like riff on themselves in a way that's actually very, very distinct to you. And sometimes there are combinations of different archetypes and mixtures of them. And sometimes you'll get a sense of being connected with something very universal and very eternal. And then there's a strange way that there's like a uniqueness that starts to come in. But it never really loses that infinity either. So it starts to become unique and singular and definite, but it's always got infinity and the inexhaustibility of these like deep archetypal blueprints shining through it. So, I mean, there's so much more I could say just about even the differences in the ways that imaginal practice on an individual level can come through with different depths of stillness and maybe intensification of whatever we call the energy body, and the intensity of resonance and ripening that can have, and what the analogy might be to that starting to happen in a group and what the conditions are. I have a sense of like we're just starting to like dip our toes in the water of this more kind of collective imaginal field way of picking up these practices. Yeah.
Okay, so this was absolutely incredible for me on so many levels. When I started, I saw the hands And it was such a deep resonance. But what I actually thought, what I was trying to do too is keep simple symbols and not, I'm a storyteller. I am an artist. I study creativity. I could go on forever and evolve and, twist my own story and vision. And the Imaginal was so beautiful to take that pause and allow others to come in and flow, because I'm so alone in my Imaginal. And I think that loneliness in the Imaginal drives fantasy and drives this inauthenticness, because then there's this desperation to be in the Imaginal. And I felt this deep release where my vision, I wasn't carrying it alone, right? There are others who are here with me. And I was able to bring in, and Adam, when you mentioned pain, oh my gosh, I needed to sit with the pain. And that brought me so much more into the Imaginal and away from the fantasy, and allowed me to really deeply just be with the images and to feel safe within my own body. There was this deep knowing when you mentioned the banyan tree. I also deeply knew, because I had seen a tree in my own collective vision, but to have it crystallized into the banyan tree. And Sam, you gave all these details, same with Artem, to my own exploration, to my own seeking. And my seeking just became like I stopped searching and I sat with the collective and realized how much I am not alone, because every Artem, Sam, Adam, every image that you saw was an extension of my own, so deeply. It's absolutely, this work is incredible. Thanks. I didn't know there were others who do this work. And this just shows me that, living in the Imaginal and seeing it so deeply. And I'm yet to find that deep resonant community. So here I am. It was really, I'm glad I popped in.
Yeah, thanks for showing up, Lena. I wanted to also reflect a couple of things that, like something you said, Sam, about like it was very fundamental. Like there was something like elemental and fundamental. It was very like matter of fact. Like it was just like very like just how existence is, or how life is, or like the fundamental building blocks of life. And then you were talking, Adam, you were like kind of reflecting on like your experience and like what was kind of happening for you personally, or how it was connecting to you personally. And that's like, there's kind of like a subtle like thread of that, of like, okay, like it wasn't really there. It was like maybe like briefly I would just notice. I'm like, oh, what does that mean? And then it would kind of subside. Or what does that mean for me? It would subside. But then afterwards, after I'm done, I'm like, okay, I'm like, what is this? How does this continue? Or how does this play on? Or it's like, what is my relationship to these images? And, one of the things that like is a big thread in my life is awakening and a deepening into that. And I'm actually gearing up for a retreat next week. So it was interesting how this circle had, to me, more of this kind of universal flavor. It felt more impersonal to me. And, you were mentioning, Sam, how like over time it can kind of become more unique. Like these fundamental images start to express and like have a more unique expression. And, also this practice is very new to me. Like, so I imagine there is a capacity and a capability that we develop through doing this. And there is also like the part of me that's like more logical, or like what do I do with this? Or like, what does this mean? Where it's like very like, it's just like all these beautiful images, and it's like, okay. And it's like, oh yeah, earth and life and water and like, there's a simple beauty to it. And then my mind's also like, well, what does it mean for me personally? Kind of. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, Artem. I mean, so much to say there. Like they're so, I can hold the contrast between this session, right? And, I can just reflect, you and I did what I've called the deep alignment session. And so something I didn't talk about here. So we just did open reverie. So we didn't set an intention. We didn't calibrate any inclination that we were bringing. The first maybe year that this practice was developing, it was all that. It was all open reverie, the original group that was doing it. And then eventually started playing with, because one important thing about collective presencing practice, which is more just doing a dialogue practice with that same co-sensing, so there's always a guiding question. There's always something that kind of focuses the intentionality in the field. And so, on one hand, when there's no specific intention and there's four bodies with maybe relatively low context with each other, getting to know each other, it just makes sense that, what might start coming through in the shared field is going to run back to the universal and the general, right? When you and I did, so just to share like this practice I'm calling deep alignment, it works with the same kind of moves and protocol, but the main difference is, usually I'm doing it with a person, and the thing that we're almost wanting to put in the middle is that person's, you can call it so many different things, soul's calling, vow, is a word I really like. What's the particular form that's coming in? And I'm just thinking about back to how specific, particular the things that were coming through in our session, was Artem, things that you wouldn't think are in the total mythological archetypal realm. They're very kind of specified and unique. So if there is a universal, if there are universal archetypes that are getting riffed on, they've really crystallized into particular form. And then the important thing too is, I was doubtful about doing this practice. I'm like, oh, it can't possibly work that way. The conscious mind coming in and I'm going to set an intention, then the imaginal is going to be responsive to that. And yet I've, over time, I've gained more and more trust that under the right conditions, a well-calibrated kind of heartful intention almost held as a resonance and brought into these kind of shared imaginal attunement practices, that soul or the imaginal, is in some sense responsive and an invitation to many things probably, but I'll just say, vow, wanting to allow somebody's unique signature to body forth in a shared way, imaginally. There's something there in my experience. Yeah.
Sam, may I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Did you feel, maybe I'll ask all of you, this is really bizarre because did anybody feel like I was dominating? That my space was being dominating to, I guess that's my question.
You personally, Lena, in the context of the shared
in the
field?
context of the collective, because I just feel, I guess I will just pose, not necessarily dominating, but I feel like I've done this work so much and studied Carl Jung, and I study neuroscience and creativity, and I think a part of me was leading with a very set vision and a very set idea of what I was perceiving. And I guess I had told a story before, but not, it was just strange how when you said banyan tree, when I had a dream about, so I'll just say this, I had a dream about 2 years ago. And I was really leading with that dream, I guess, when the hands, but you said banyan tree and all of these parts led me back to that dream space. And I'm just like, how did we collectively come back to my dream from 2 years ago? And that dream wasn't present when I came in. But then as we went on that dream, I'm like, we're totally telling this dream that I had 2 years ago. And I was able to remember. And I guess my question is how much, yeah, I mean, the question resonates. How much was that dream like dominating the space, or that past collective versus the presencing of now? Like, and was that creating a space where I was dominating, or is that just a natural part of the work where you remember it and bring back? It's just amazing to me, but also a little bit scary. I'm like, man, that's powerful for me. But like, it feels selfish. I feel really selfish for some reason. And like, that's what's arising.
Well, yeah. I'm appreciating the question, Lena. And, you know, I think one of the things I'm hearing is like a desire to find a way to like right relationship in these shared spaces, you know, maybe with something that feels very potentially quite precious, you know, and like a concern of like really wanting it to be an imagined commons, so to speak. And the first thing I'll just say is that, at least in my own experience, I didn't experience any kind of domination, you know. And I'm actually realizing the stuff that you were struggling with, like, couldn't have been known until you named that, because there's deeper context where some of these images are hearkening back to a dream that had come through for you, you know, and maybe a concern of like bringing that in a way that then skews the relevance of the images or the context of the images.
Totally. Exactly.
And yet, I mean, there's so much unknowability here, right? Because how there's maybe no way of knowing to what degree, you know, a kind of planting of a dream might be importing a personal thing, and yet how much is that dream you had sitting on top of something more universal or archetypal? And have you encountered Cynthia Bourgeault's work on the Imaginal and her book Eye of the Heart?
Oh, no, actually, thank you.
I would highly recommend it. It's a good book. And she's, you know, coming from a Christian mystic perspective and actually drawing quite a bit on Gurdjieff.
I love Gurdjieff. I haven't read her, but oh my gosh. Yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, she's drawing on something that rhymes with Neoplatonism, you know, and these kind of subtle realms. And one of the things that she introduces, and my good friend Rosa Lewis, speaking of like our other people doing this work, my friend Rosa Lewis has also developed something called shared imaginal practice. She's a good friend. We've had dialogues about what even is the imaginal, you know, and something we've spoken about is, you know, what Cynthia Bourgeault has called imaginal causality. And I guess the best way of trying to describe imaginal causality, it's the way that a field of time and resonance starts to open when we tune into the imaginal. So it's as if these things that are outside and beneath or behind time, once we start connecting and resonating with them, then a field of like mnemonically mediated memory tissue or something, you know, and resonances of this image, now I'm remembering this time when this image came, and then back then, and now I'm starting to see this whole tapestry open up, and there's like a shared field of meaning that's like binding all of these dispersed moments through time, as though they're refracting from something timeless. Is the way I
exactly. That's you worded it well, and I think there's a fear of my power of consciousness. I feel I've done so much work since I was little. I've always been curious and reading philosophy, and I'm just like, having trouble grasping how truly, truly powerful I'm going to say we are, and how so much the pain lies in how many of us do not realize that, and how empowerment is actually this soft, beautiful opening, and how in our society too we see empowerment as we're going to yell for our rights, blah, 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 and how so truly, truly humbling. I'm like, am I being dominant? Because it's like, no, I'm sitting in my authentic power. and in my authentic power and connecting that to the collective. But like the sense of awe, I'm just like, whoa, this is incredible. I get to experience this. So I'm gonna mute. I feel complete. Wow. I'm gonna just have a moment of, dude, I'm proud of myself for doing this work. And I'm lucky to have you all.
Yeah, I trust your power, Lena. I feel like this same thread came up in the Jhana call about like power and like how do we navigate that power. But I trust you and I trust your power. So just kind of like encouraging you to lean into that.
No, we all once they start seeing our own power through the lens of enlightenment, it like the world changes. We're not victims anymore. We are the creators of our own reality. Like, yeah, it's destiny is only destiny is only created through what we perceive. And it's just like, I'm always like, wake the fuck up, people. Like, it's not that hard. And then I take a deep breath and I'm like, oh, yeah. Humble is a weird word. But Sam, I just wanted to ask you one last question. Yeah, I guess this was a beautiful practice. I'm grateful. How long have you been? I bet you mentioned, I'm just going to look up your work, and because I bet you introduced yourself at the beginning. But yeah, I was just curious about Artem. I have to go.
Yeah.
Take another call, but
Yeah, no worries. Yeah.
Where can I find this again?
You can just look up samhinds.com, right? Am I saying your name right? Hinds?
You are, yeah.
Yeah, so samhinds.com, and all of that information is there. I actually also have to jump off the call. So, but I'm this is a recording, so it will be shared and you guys all have my contacts. So, I'll be following up with all this information. So there'll be a way to stay connected to Sam and connected to this practice.
Yeah, I was just going to say I'm studying design and neuroscience right now, and I would love to talk more, Sam, about these experiences and also talk to him about the mind, body, and the brain lens and how this connects to the neural space. So I'm just intrigued. So beautiful. Yeah, I'll send you a little email for sure.
Great. Yeah, please feel free to be in touch. Let's chat, and Adam as well, and anybody who may be tuning in, feel free to reach out and get in touch. And Artem, thanks for holding this space and for having me on.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks a lot, Sam. Appreciate what you do, and thank you all for joining. All right. Be well.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Yeah.
Well, everyone.
Ciao.
Bye.